Hello class, it's Mr. McGregor
And Mr. S.
and we're back with another amazing video that we know y'all couldn't wait for. Well, in this episode, we're going to explain how animals and plants use sugars made by the plants. We will explain how energy and atoms are transferred, that means to move, between plants and animals. We will also discuss the organelles and the chemical processes involved with moving around energy and atoms.
So first, let's revisit what a plant is. Plants are a type of photosynthetic organism, and some are made of many cells, like trees. Plants means they are photosynthetic organisms that live on land, and some are only made of a single cell, like algae.
So to recap, photosynthetic organisms are classified as autotrophs. So auto meaning self, troph meaning feeding or food. And they have the ability to build inorganic matter into organic molecules using sunlight. Organic molecules are special because these can be used as food by the autotroph.
So the inorganic matter we are referring to here is carbon dioxide, CO2, and water, H2O. And during photosynthesis, the organic matter that is made is referring to C6H12O6, or sugar. You could also call it glucose. The process that can build sugars from the inorganic molecules, CO2 and H2O, is powered by the sun's energy and is called photosynthesis. And just a note, oxygen is technically an inorganic matter molecule too. It is made during photosynthesis, but it's just a byproduct.
So at this point, you've seen this chemical reaction roughly 1,000 times, maybe more. Okay, we've gone over this a bunch. You should have it memorized. You should be able to say it forward and backward. But to recap, and because the more you see something, the more ingrained it's going to become, this is the chemical reaction for photosynthesis. So remember, the process where you take some things and turn them into new things is called a chemical reaction.
So let's now break down the chemical reaction for photosynthesis by first discussing the molecules going into this chemical reaction. These are essentially the ingredients, CO2 and H2O. They are called the reactants, and once again, they are what are going into this chemical reaction, specifically named photosynthesis. Here is a visual model of the reactants in photosynthesis, and then what is created in photosynthesis is shown right here in their molecular formula. These are called the products, and these are the things that are made during photosynthesis. Here, again, is a visual representation of the molecular formula seen above. So there is glucose, C6H12O6, and there is oxygen. Focusing on just the products right now, this is glucose and this is oxygen, and you can see that they're both made out of very similar atoms. Specifically the red ones, which are oxygen, and it's something to take note of that the physical arrangement of the atoms give them their physical properties. For example, adding carbon and hydrogen to these oxygens over here turns glucose into sugar, which is a solid and sweet to the taste, and these are just oxygen atoms, and this is actually a gas. Has no taste, and you need to breathe it in to do cellular respiration. So it's just interesting that the arrangement of the atoms is what gives a molecule its physical properties.
So in the process of photosynthesis, the atoms, through the energy from the sunlight, are freed from their bonds. Yeah, so these bonds here are broken. And imagine like the pearls coming off of the string from a pearl necklace. Okay, and then they're just being rearranged in a new configuration over here. Here they are, all free. And then the atoms are rearranged and new bonds are made to make this glucose and this oxygen.
But how is this possible? How can you just break the bonds of these molecules right here and create these molecules? And you can kind of see my point when I'm talking about the amount of atoms you start with over here and the atoms you end up with over here. For example, you'll notice that there are 3 red atoms on the reactant side. But on the product side, there are 8 red dots. Why don't you go ahead and add up the rest? How many hydrogens are there on the product side? How many hydrogens are there on the reactant side? How many carbons are there on the product side? How many carbons are on the reactant side? Well, hopefully this is what you came up with.
And you'll see that the math just doesn't add up. How did 1 carbon atom turn into 6 carbon atoms? How did 2 hydrogen atoms become 12, etc.? Well, it's not possible. Well, look at the formula now, okay? You might say, like, oh, it's a different formula. It's not, actually. These 6s didn't just appear. This means 6 molecules of water and 6 molecules of carbon dioxide that are needed to make this 1 glucose molecule and then 6 oxygen molecules. All right, so sometimes we show the formula of the chemical reaction in shorthand just to get the concept down. Like, there is carbon dioxide and water that goes into making sugar and oxygen. But if we were to actually make this chemical equation correct and balanced, then we would do it like this. So these 6s just mean 6 carbon dioxides and 6 water molecules. So to prove it to you, why don't you take a second and count the atoms now? It should make a whole lot more sense than it did in the last example we gave you. All right, so go through and count each of these, and you'll see that it's balanced now. Another thing to remember that this 6 CO2 right here and 6 H2O, these guys, it's very similar to algebra. Like, when you have an equation in algebra, you need to balance it. Think of it kind of like the distributive property. If there were parentheses around this, you would distribute that 6 to each of these terms inside the parentheses. It's really similar to that. If you counted correctly, you should have a balanced number of atoms for oxygen, hydrogen, and carbon on each side of this chemical reaction.
This entire thing that we were just describing is called balancing an equation. And this right here is a balanced equation. A balanced equation shows or demonstrates the law of conservation of matter, which demands that the number of atoms on one side of a chemical equation equals the atoms on the other side of the chemical equation. And that's because, of course, atoms just don't pop out of nowhere.
Kind of a sweet trick, right? Photosynthetic organisms take carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight, and make sugar. Like this delicious apple that I'm eating right now.
So a question a scientific mind might ask themselves is, why do photosynthesis at all? Why does the tree want to bother making glucose in the first place? It's because plants do a lot with the carbohydrates they are making during photosynthesis. For example, the sugars can be combined in ways to make the following, such as this potato or this peach or apple, whatever that is, maple syrup, or even to make their bodies. For example, the tough fibers in rope, those are all made of sugars. But beyond that, those sugars are storing energy. And that energy is originating from the sunlight that was used to power photosynthesis. So the real reason plants made sugars in the first place was to capture and store the sun's energy. This energy from the sun is what plants are using to power their bodies. Therefore, plants are solar powered. But where is the sun's energy stored within these sugar molecules, within this glucose? The energy from the sun is stored actually within the bonds between the atoms. So right here, and here, and here, and here, and here, and here. All the bonds that are made during photosynthesis are storing that solar energy. But how do you release the energy within those bonds? Well, to release the energy within the bonds, you're going to need to
break the bonds. Kaboom!
But where does this making and breaking of sugars actually happen? I know you all just responded autotroph right now, and you wouldn't be wrong if you said that. But you would be more right if you said it was by the cells in an autotroph. And you'd be even more right if you said inside the autotroph's cell. More specifically, it happens in the chloroplast. Plants have many chloroplasts in their cells, all of which do photosynthesis, sugar and oxygen production. And if we look a little bit closer, if we were to zoom in with our digital microscope here, this is what. And of course, these are the things that make a plant appear green because of the green pigment that is on the surface of the thylakoids. If you remember us talking about color a while back. And remember back when we said that we need plants, but plants don't need us? Well, that's because they also have another organelle that is crucial for freeing that energy, which is contained in the sugar that they made, and that organelle is a mitochondria. So yes, plants have mitochondria as well. So here is a close-up of that mitochondria, not a brain. And this is where cellular respiration happens. So plants do both photosynthesis and cellular respiration. And in order to do that, they need to have both chloroplast and mitochondria.
And by just looking at the chemical equations for each of these, you can see cellular respiration, which is happening in the mitochondria, is glucose, C6H12O6, plus 6 molecules of oxygen, combine during cellular respiration to release energy and create 6 molecules of carbon dioxide and 6 molecules of water. So we have sugar, oxygen, making carbon dioxide and water. And then in photosynthesis, we have carbon dioxide and water going through photosynthesis to create sugar and oxygen. So you can see here that this portion of the equation, cellular respiration, the ingredients, the reactants, are the products. They are what are made during photosynthesis. And what is made during cellular respiration, the products, go into photosynthesis. They are the reactants of photosynthesis, the ingredients necessary. So chloroplasts make energy-storing sugar molecules. And that energy came from the sun. So the sun is going to shoot photons of light, which are going to be absorbed by the chloroplasts in the plant's leaves, and the chloroplasts will, by means of photosynthesis, make these sugars, these organic molecules, and oxygen. And then mitochondria, right here, use that oxygen and use the sugar to release the energy within the sugar in the form of ATP. So the sugars that are storing the sun's energy, they go into a mitochondria, and the mitochondria is in charge of releasing that energy, unlocking that sugar and releasing the energy inside. And also heat tends to be released during this process as well. So chloroplasts capture energy while mitochondria release the energy. So they are both complementary to one another. One is making sugars to store energy, while the other is releasing the energy in the sugars into a molecule the body can use to power its processes. But even beyond that, after the mitochondria break those sugars down and they break the bonds to release that energy that was stored in the sugar, they will then create CO2 and water, carbon dioxide and water. And that carbon dioxide and water is actually crucial to allow photosynthesis to happen. So not only are chloroplasts making something for mitochondria, mitochondria then make something right here. They make something that the chloroplasts need. So this is a beautifully complementary process. Another way to think about this is that the chloroplasts will be recycling the atoms used in cellular respiration. So hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen, this is being released by the process of cellular respiration. These atoms are being released in the form of carbon dioxide and water, and then they will be used to reconstruct sugar. And then those sugars are taken and reconstructed, the atoms are reconstructed into these molecules. And then these molecules are broken down and reconstructed into sugar and oxygen. And then they are broken down and reconstructed into these molecules. So you can see that this is almost like recycling. When you really break it down, this is almost like a recycling process of these three atoms: carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. The mitochondria and the chloroplasts just keep using them like Legos to build new structures, breaking them down, and then building new structures and giving it to the other organelle and breaking it down again and rebuilding new structures. And it's the same atoms, though. They're just kind of being recycled. And it kind of sounds like I'm just yammering on here, but I really want you to understand this. When we say that a chloroplast makes sugar and oxygen, when we say that a mitochondria makes CO2 and water, these molecules just didn't come out of nowhere. They're made by the subunits that are atoms. So really it's just a building and breaking down of molecules, but it's the same building blocks, the same atoms are being used to build these things. But truly, the process begins with photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is the beginning of this recycling process. So since it is the beginning of the cycle, since it is responsible for taking sunlight and building molecules that store that sunlight, some might argue that it is the most important chemical process in all of nature. Not only in this little cycle you see, but because only photosynthesis can trap the sun's energy in a sugar molecule. And in another way, only photosynthesis can make a molecule to trap the sun's energy. But others may argue that the mitochondria and the chloroplasts are equally as important, since they are needed by multicellular organisms to release the energy and convert it into a form the cell can use. Since sugars aren't necessarily useful, actually they aren't useful directly, especially to animal cells, unless they're broken down and converted into these ATP molecules. So if you didn't have a mitochondria, then you would just have a bunch of sugar. To better describe this point of view, think of it this way. Imagine a person in the woods here, a woodsman, is gathering all this wood because it is so cold and he would like to get warm, so he has all this wood piled up. But what good is that wood to this guy if he doesn't have a fire started to actually release the energy that is stored within that wood over here? The wood is supposed to represent the sugars made during photosynthesis. And whatever started this fire is supposed to represent the mitochondria. And that's because, just like the piles of wood here store energy that can only be seen once you actually ignite the wood and a fire gets going, sugars made during photosynthesis have energy that can only be released once the mitochondria is used. And after that, then the energy is released. So if it weren't for the mitochondria, just like if it weren't for whatever started this fire, the energy would just stay locked up inside the sugars, just like the energy would just stay locked up inside the wood here if you didn't set them on fire. So in summary, the energy stored inside of sugar would be unattainable if it were not for a mitochondria who can actually take those sugars and get the energy out of them so an organism can use those sugars and the energy inside them to power its body. So let's just take a step back for just a moment here. Kind of in summary, a plant uses the sun's energy to take carbon dioxide and water to construct this energy storing molecule called glucose. And inside that glucose molecule, you have energy stored. But to get to that energy, you will need to break the bonds between the atoms and free them. That will release the energy that was stored inside that sugar. And after doing so, look what comes back. Water and carbon dioxide. So you put in water and carbon dioxide, and you get a sugar molecule, then you break that sugar molecule, which releases energy, and the atoms are reconfigured back into water and carbon dioxide. And beyond that basic premise, here's another one we discussed, which is you can link these glucose molecules together to make long chains, and those long chains are used by plants to build their bodies. So with those two basic premises, try to predict the solution to this question. What should happen to the amount of water and CO2 in an environment if a tree was going to grow larger and larger? Well, hopefully you've said that the amount of CO2 and water in the environment would decrease as the plant is growing and taking in these molecules and using their atoms to construct its body. Which is, it makes sense because this is something similar you're used to if you've ever played with Legos or any type of block, right? If you have a bunch of Legos, single Legos, just, singly on the carpet, strewn around you, and you start building a tower, all of a sudden the amount of Legos just sitting on the carpet start to disappear because they are now in the tower. So they're not really disappearing, they're just being used to build a larger object. Just like the CO2 and the water, those molecules aren't directly used to build the tree, but the atoms inside those molecules, the CO2 and the water, are going to be plucked apart and rebuilt into sugars that the plant is constructing its body from. So back again to this. What happens to the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere if we let trees grow? All incorporated in a sugar molecule that is going to be used to build its body. So the bigger the trees get, the less CO2 is in the air. Now, as an important side note, just so you're not misled, or at least that you're not confused, trees do make a little bit of CO2. They have to. Since they have mitochondria to make the ATP necessary for their body, they will take a sugar through photosynthesis. They will do cellular respiration, which means they do make CO2. They make carbon dioxide. And so when we're talking about climate change, and a lot of answers to how do we fix climate change is plant more trees, well, climate change is caused by too much CO2 in the air. So how will, trees solve this issue if they're making CO2 as well? Well, remember this fact. Plants take in just about 2 times as much CO2 as they release. So they absorb twice as much CO2 as they release. So they do release CO2, but they absorb way more. So try to finish this. For every 1 carbon dioxide molecule photosynthetic organisms put into the atmosphere, they are taking how many out? Hopefully you came to the conclusion that they would be taking 2 carbon dioxide molecules out. So for every 1 they put in, they take 2 out, which means they are taking in more than they are releasing. So here's another way of looking at it. Here are 6 carbon dioxide atoms, or molecules, 6 carbon dioxide molecules. They go into this tree's chloroplasts. The tree will use those carbon dioxides to make their body. So the tree gets slightly bigger. This is clearly exaggerated, but it will get slightly bigger. And then, not only to build their bodies, but to power them, they will need to take some of the sugars that are made, put them into mitochondria, and as the sugar is broken down, carbon dioxide is released. But only as 3 carbon dioxide molecules. So 6, and then only 3 are released. So those 3 carbon dioxide molecules that are missing, okay, 3 came out. The 3 that are missing did not just disappear, they're actually inside of this tree. They were incorporated into sugars when photosynthesis occurred, and now they're trapped inside that tree. And after some of those sugars were taken to a mitochondria, 3 carbon dioxide molecules resulted and were released. So that does mean that essentially, when you look at a tree, if you want to look at it at an atomic scale, these things are just giant banks of oxygen, hydrogen, and carbon. We call them banks because they are places where you can store these atoms. They are stored in sugar molecules. So that means that this entire tree at the atomic scale is just essentially oxygen, hydrogen, and carbon. But if you're wondering, well, why don't we just see these little atoms? Why do trees look the way they do? Well, remember, it's the way that the oxygen, hydrogen, and carbon are combined together. When they are combined differently, remember, just like oxygen by itself is a gas, Sugars are solids, so that's why they look the way they do. And depending on how those atoms are connected and those molecules get connected, that gives you the visual appearance of the things. But even, the iPad in your hand right now or the chair under your butt, that is all made of atoms, just a pile of atoms, but they are bound to each other in certain ways that give them their physical appearance. So by themselves, they are too small to see, but depending on how they combine with one another, they give us the various shapes and colors and textures and objects that you see in everyday life. But they are very much real. And once again, it kind of sounds like I'm rambling on about atoms and what does that have to do with anything? Well, that's because atoms aren't just needed by plants, they are also needed by other organisms as well. Other organisms also need energy. So where are the atoms and the energy that are needed by organisms that cannot make their own food coming from? Such things that need to eat to get atoms and to get energy are called heterotrophs, such as this elephant right here, and maybe this mushroom right there. They don't have chloroplasts, so they can't take carbon dioxide, sunlight, and water, and take the energy from the sunlight, and take the atoms from the water and the carbon dioxide to construct their bodies. They only have the organelle that creates energy, the mitochondria. So to get the sugar, they themselves can't be doing photosynthesis. They have to grab the sugars from something else, and then, since they do have a mitochondria, they can use that mitochondria to get the energy. And they can metabolize those sugars, break them down to get their atoms. So here's a bit of a better visualization. You can see here that the atoms, there's the carbon, there was the oxygen, there's the hydrogen in this elephant's trunk. These atoms that are inside these heterotrophs, they originated from a plant. So right now, as you are sitting in your seat, and if you just look at your arm, you'd have to realize that all the atoms that make up your body originated in a plant. Even if you chose not to eat plants and you're like, I only eat meat. Well, if you ate, let's say, a chicken, you only eat chicken, well, that chicken eats plants. So the atoms from the plant went into the chicken, and then you ate the chicken to get your atoms. But still, those atoms originated from a plant, of whom could do photosynthesis. And in a kind of a twice removed type of way, that means that since the plant was getting its atoms from water and carbon dioxide, in a weird way, the majority of your body is actually made from carbon dioxide and water. So it's made of air and water. That's what your body is made of. So I'll let that sink in for a second, right? Carbon dioxide in the air, those atoms, the carbon and the oxygens, and then the hydrogen and the oxygen and water. That's where you got your atoms from. But not only that, the energy that is used to power your body, that also came from plants who were able to take the sun's photons, the energy from the sun, store that energy in sugars, and then when an elephant eats the plant, or if the plant, dies and this mushroom eats that, once they break the sugars down, they release the energy that was once sunlight. So in another weird way, the energy that you run on came from the sun at some point. So in a way, we're all kind of solar powered, since that's where the energy originated. So with those concepts in mind that we just talked about, the fact that you get your atoms from plants, that animals only have mitochondria, so these heterotrophs here, This one is a herbivore. It only eats plants. Herbivore. This one's an omnivore, so it eats plants and animals. This is a grizzly bear. This one right here is a mushroom. It also is a heterotroph, not a plant. It only has mitochondria. So the question here is, what if there were only heterotrophs? What if there were only organisms that have mitochondria? What would happen to the amount of CO2, carbon dioxide, levels in the air if you only have heterotrophs and no autotrophs? Well, hopefully you realize that CO2 levels would increase over time. These organisms would be eating plant material or eating other animals or plants in the case of this omnivore, and they would be using the sugars they get and taking those sugars to a mitochondria, which would just slowly expel more and more CO2. So more and more carbon dioxide would fill the air. So what could we add to this scene right here to bring CO2 levels down, to remove the carbon dioxide in the air? What could we add to this scenario? What type of organism? And hopefully you've realized that I'm referring to plants. If we added plants, they would actually suck in this CO2 by doing photosynthesis with the chloroplasts that heterotrophs do not have. So the elephant, the bear, the mushroom do not have chloroplasts, but plants, these green beings with their chlorophyll color, can do photosynthesis and suck the CO2 out of the air. And as these plants continue to grow larger and larger, they are taking more and more CO2 out of the air. Right? So once again, with all the climate change and global warming issues that we're having and the threat that that issue poses, how can we limit the amount of CO2 in the air so the Earth does not keep trapping heat? Well, you can plant some trees, and these trees will take the CO2 out of the air, which allows less heat to be captured. So let's go in a totally different direction. What happens when a person loses weight? So this person right here has decided they want to lose some weight, so they're going to work out in various ways. And if she's made of atoms, and the atoms and their total weight is what actually causes you to be a certain weight, how can she lose weight? Right? She'd have to actually lose atoms. Atoms would have to, what, fall out of her body? Where are all those atoms going? If she's made of all these little atoms, if she loses weight, that's directly correlated with her losing atoms. Well, actually, when you lose weight, so she just lost some weight here, you actually breathe out the atoms. That's where they go. They were in you, and then you breathe them out. Your mitochondria will tap into your fat and glycogen stores and burn those. The mitochondria will burn those sugars, those stored energy sources, lipids, and will release CO2. And you actually lose weight by breathing out. So if this person just stayed this size, they would be breathing out a certain amount of CO2. But when they're losing weight, they're actually breathing out more CO2 than normal because they have burnt more sugar than normal, more lipids than normal. And so they'll actually be making more CO2. So a person losing weight is actually breathing out more CO2 than they normally would. So here we go. Now she's this size, and let's say, I guess she still wants to lose weight. Maybe she's training even for a marathon and thinks she'll get a better time if she has less weight. Well, as she continues to work out, more and more CO2 is released. And then she goes to this size right here. So it's pretty amazing that when you lose weight, you have to realize, or if you're gaining weight, regardless, you're actually either adding or losing atoms. And so this is her final size. And if she stays that weight, she will generate a consistent amount of CO2. So as she lost weight, she produced more and more CO2 because that's how she's losing weight. There's actually air. In the air she breathes out, there's more CO2 than normal, right? Because when she loses weight, just parts aren't falling off to get her to this size, right? So where do the atoms go? She breathed them out through cellular respiration. All right, now we're veering in another direction. Totally different direction here. What happens to all your tissues? Okay, right? Tissues are just many cells that have the same job, and they're working together to do the same job. Where did all the atoms go that make up your body? Because here we have this jolly old man, and he dies. And then this is what he's going to look like at some point. Skeleton. If we weighed these two versions of this guy, this dude, right? And then what's left over of him? This one is going to weigh more. This version of the guy is going to weigh more. And once again, that has to do with the amount of atoms in his body. Okay? So there's way more atoms here in this version than in here. But where did all those atoms go? When he became a skeleton, where did it just disappeared and the underlying skeleton was left over? Well, no. What happened to him and what will happen to all of us is that your tissues are relatively easy for decomposers to turn into other things. They will use your body for food, and then they will breathe you out. When they take in your body, that's essentially their food. The sugars in your body, the lipids, the proteins, all those things made of atoms will be used by the decomposers, these organisms that eat dead material. They will eat that material, and they all have mitochondria. Okay, unless it's bacteria. The bacteria won't have mitochondria, but they still will produce CO2 when they are taking in your tissues, and then you will be breathed out essentially as CO2. And after the tissues of your body are breathed out, all that's left over is a skeleton. And even the skeleton will break down over time. It just takes a lot longer. That's why we find, if you go back hundreds of years and look in coffins, you're going to find skeletons left over. Well, the skeletons are just harder for decomposers to break down, so they last longer. But if you looked into a coffin that was let's say 2,000 years old, that skeleton's not going to be there anymore, or at least very little is going to actually be left over. So the only reason why you turn into a skeleton after you die is that's only because it's a time-related thing. If people waited long enough to look at what was inside your coffin or whatever, there'd be nothing left at some point. You would be totally turned into carbon dioxide and various other things, which will then be taken in by, once again, a plant, and the cycle continues. So let's summarize this in this chart here that I've made. So these are the atoms in the air right here. Now this is water. Water is also in the air, but most plants take that up with their roots. But anyway, these are the atoms in the air and in the environment that a producer will then take in. So a producer will take in hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen. They will take that in. A heterotroph might then eat that producer, that plant, okay, that autotroph, might take in the atoms that it took from the air, okay, and took from water, and now it's in its body. And heterotrophs might eat other heterotrophs too. That's why this arrow is kind of like this roundabout arrow. Because let's say the perfect example from earlier, okay, chicken eats some grain that is from a plant. So now it goes from the grain, the plant, into the chicken, and then you eat the chicken. And then, so that's what this circle's about. Or maybe a fox eats the chicken. But it's heterotrophs exchanging these atoms amongst themselves. And then the heterotrophs, the fox, or it could be a polar bear, or it could be you, or it could be the plant. All those atoms in their tissues, if the producer isn't eaten by a heterotroph, it will go to a decomposer. If the heterotroph isn't eaten by another heterotroph, it will go to a decomposer. Now the atoms are in the decomposers. And then the decomposers breathe out those atoms, and they go back into the air as oxygen and carbon dioxide and water, mostly as carbon dioxide though. And almost, to tell you the truth, decomposers, they only have mitochondria, so it's really only CO2 that they're breathing out. Other plants, when they take in that CO2, might make some oxygen. The decomposers will actually make water as well. That's another part of cellular respiration. So the atoms went to the producers, maybe went to the decomposers. The atoms went to the producers, and then maybe they went to heterotrophs, who then went to decomposers. And then those atoms, once they're in decomposers, will be breathed out as water and carbon dioxide. Other plants who take in the carbon dioxide might actually make oxygen as well, but essentially, look, the cycle has started over again. So this is a cycle. Matter is constantly cycled. It's constantly changing form. So that really means that all the atoms that are in you right now are just on loan. They belonged to someone else or something else before you, and they will leave your body at some point and go to something else. So the atoms that are in you, there is statistically saying that at least one atom in your body belonged to Gandhi, and one of the atoms in your body belonged to Sir Isaac Newton. It's just probability that these atoms move so frequently through an environment that our atoms are constantly changing form and being exchanged amongst all of us. So the atoms you take in, they will eventually be used by something else. It's almost like a type of reincarnation. There are atoms in your body that without a doubt have been part of dinosaurs. And when you die, that's not the end of the story. Those atoms will then, become a baby bird or something. Maybe a raccoon. By way of this process, by the way of this cycle of photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So once again, the atoms that we have are pretty much on loan. The atoms will continue to circle around the environment, and some will make their way around the world as part of a never-ending cycle. So hopefully you enjoyed this video. In this episode, we explained how animals and plants use the sugars made by plants. We will explain, and we did explain, how energy and atoms are transferred or moved between plants and animals and through the environment. We also discussed the organelles in these chemical processes. We discussed the mitochondria doing cellular respiration and the chloroplasts doing photosynthesis, and how they are all involved with the movement of this energy from the sun and the atoms. Alright, and till next time.